Works of Love is a Rosecraft production. This is Works of Love, the podcast. I'm Julian Silver. Works of Love is a meditation on a theme through listener-submitted personal essays. That theme? Love, the possession of and lack of it. Today's essay is from Oscar McCoy from Salem, Oregon. His essay is entitled, At the Root. I was never particularly close to my father, seeing as how he left us when I was 2. Never a card, never a call. Birthdays and Christmases came and went, without notice. On my graduation, my uncle showed up a week before the ceremony, because he was a simple man. Good-natured, but simple. He had to skip town the night before I walked because of an outstanding warrant. Many years later, Mom and me had a falling out. So did me and my brother. Most of my life has been spent falling out. I lost my girlfriend to my boss, and that boss fired me. So I figured this staying in one place and building a life sort of thing wasn't for me. My mother joked my father was a tumbleweed. So I spent most of my 20s driving around in an old 2005 Pontiac Sunfire. A white convertible with a top that wouldn't go up. But that old thing and me, we toured this country. Texas sunsets in summer, where hordes of mosquitoes dot the damp horizons and itchy swarms. Winters in San Diego, taking a bite out of some Iraqi pastry, after washing down a breakfast burrito with some German lager, navigating New Mexican state parks with one headlight, falling asleep under the desert stars in that inky canyon darkness. Of course, that's the romanticized version. A lot of my time was spent scrounging for drug money, getting high, crashing, and then pursuing more drugs. But that's all right. Even tumbleweeds fly sometimes. Somehow I scraped enough money together for a phone, and somewhere in my head I remembered my mother's number. I rang her, but she didn't pick up, so I left a message, and she never called. Can't blame her. Not the way we left it. That woman has a right to her pain, and I'm not a person to tell someone when they ought to forgive. Called my brother, and he did answer. Our conversation was a lot of silence, interrupted by a single question. You gonna apologize? Now here's the funny thing. I wanted to. I was angling for it. I think that's the reason I called my family. Something was wrong, and I was aiming to make it right. But when he asked me if I was going to do it, well, to hell with him. And that's where we left it. Wish I could tell you I grew up. The foolish pride beaten out of me by the various wrong turns life took me down, but none of that ever worked. Each chance I was given, I refused. In Huntington, West Virginia, me and my girl at the time were watching Citizen Kane. And there's a part where old Kane is selling control of his newspaper, and Mr. Thatcher, his lawyer, asks him, "What would you like to have been?" Kane looks at him and says, "Everything you hate." My girl stops the movie, looks me dead in the face, and says, "That's you." That night, after the movie, we talked about the future. I was just 30, and she was a few days shy of 20, but she was the breadwinner. But here was this girl, unable to drink, being a minimum wage breadwinner, and she was moon-eyed, talking about the life we'd have, the life we'd share. I kissed her as sweetly as I could, cigarette smoke in my breath, and we fell asleep. After a bit, I got up, inflatable mattress squeaking the entire time, and I picked up a duffel bag, packed some things before getting on that road again. I left her the drugs I'd been keeping from her. I figured it was a fine enough trade for the 100 I borrowed for gas, or stole, depending on your moral compass. But something about a teenager imagining her 50s struck me as improper, and I couldn't cotton to it, so I had to go. About a year after, I was working construction in Ashland when a black Buick pulled up to the site. A man in a fine suit, better than Brooks Brothers, steps out. I see him head to the portable lunchroom, then to the foreman. The foreman points a fat finger at me, and I was looking dumb at the time, seated in the scissor lift, and the man in the suit comes walking towards me. Now, I'd done a few things, but nothing big enough to warrant a G-man searching for me. I thought it could have been the 19-year-old. Maybe there was a baby McCoy I'd have to pay for. Then I wondered if I could get on the nightly news in a low-speed scissor-lift chase. "Mr. McCoy?" he said. "One of 'em," I said. "I'm here to talk to you about your father." "Never talked about him before. Not about to start." "It's about an inheritance." "Like money?" "Like money." Well, I brought myself down and I was starting to think I'd look good in a suit like his. He gave me the card at the hotel he was staying at. Convenient in that it was just a few blocks away from the one I was staying in, though I'm certain his did not have a monthly rate or needle disposal box on each floor. We made an appointment and I blew off work to make it because my boss wasn't the kind that deserved notice. When I got to the hotel room, he was in another suit, and it made me wonder if he has a lounge suit. Perhaps that's the Brooke Brothers one, although wearing suits in hotel rooms strikes me as some sort of ridiculous, and I cannot pinpoint why. But I'm not one to fixate too long on a man's sartorial choices. He told me my father died. Paused to see if I'd tear up or show any sort of emotion, maybe a hearty yell to heaven so God and his angels could hear me lament never knowing the man. It was an unnecessary pause. Then he told me the good stuff. Dad left me a house in Salem and enough money to live work-free for 2 years. I asked if I could just sell the house and live work-free for a decade. He said it'd be smarter to work on it, then sell it if my heart was set on it. He gave me the address, told me the first disbursement into my account would happen when I had proof of residence at the place. So that night I got loaded, and the next morning I drove the few hours it took to get to Salem, hungover. The house, well, the good things about it was it sat on 4 acres. The bad thing was you had to park at the edge of the lot and walk 2 acres with a machete and 2 brave men from the Yucata to help you forge your way through the growth to get to the 2-bedroom structure with an attached garage at the center of it. Inside was just as untamed as the outside. Exposed drywall, 1 bathroom that had an exposed pipe with no toilet atop it, and carpet that hadn't been changed since the Eisenhower administration. It may have been home to some of those secret government biological weapons. I pulled a cig, smoked it, and then dropped the butt on the floor. Who cares, after all? Out on the backyard, though, that's when I saw it, a large maple tree, its leaves a summer green, probably as old as the house itself. Despite all the wilderness around it, it had an elegant, near-regal barren. A few crows on its branches, I'm sure a few more higher than I could see. I started calculating the cost of repairs. A lifetime of drifting in and out of bull carpentry gave me a pretty good feel for these sorts of things. Just material itself would take up about half my year's pay. Labor, the other half to 1.5 years. And that was before looking at the garage and the hell that waited there. So I did what I always did. Left. Went to Crater Lake and just thought on things. Wondered if my brother knew about the property. Maybe he'd want to buy it. It took about half a day of thinking on that before I wondered how he felt about our dad dying. I'm not proud it took me that long to wonder how he felt, but I'm honest of it. After a week, I came back with a 24-pack in tow. I picked up a Yellow Pages from some jerk's stoop and got some camping supplies so I could pitch a tent in the old house and have some light. I figured I might as well see what came of the garage to give a better estimate of the cost. To my great surprise, when I opened it up, it was pristine. Perfectly laned cement, a brand new table saw that stops the instant it senses something other than wood, all the tools, construction and landscape one could need, and then the other half of the garage held all the materials, including a toilet outfitted with a bow. Everything needed to repair this old house and ready it for sale was there. I just needed to do the work. There was even a cot and a stereo. I looked up at the sky and thought of my old man, took a deep breath, then flipped him off. Well played. First bit of order was cleaning the yard, make it easier to reach the house in my car. I'd grown tired of walking 2 acres to get to my house. It was slow going, but it was going. A bit of advice to your listeners: blackberry bushes are as hard to beat back as embarrassing memories, but if you're consistent and unrelenting, you'll still lose, but there's a nobleness in a hard-won defeat. After the month, I was able to survey the entire property. It was beautiful once. I could picture corn swaying in the fields, a strawberry patch stretching as far as the eye could care to see. Perhaps apple trees down the line, things that grow, things that contribute to a life. Of course, I don't know if Salem is hospitable to those crops. But still, it was a nice picture, even if inaccurate. Next came the great work of the house. Starting with the bottom floor, I tore out the carpet and demoed some of the pre-World War II architecture to give it a more open floor plan. I figured on a laminate instead of the carpet that sat in the garage because I just like the feel of it. And my guess is the people who eventually bought this place would like it too. After a few lonely months, I made a friend, a western gray squirrel. Bold and curious, as I was taking a break crunching on some sunflower seed, she came up to me. Eventually, I set up a Folgers can lid and placed a handful of seeds, and we'd eat together while music played over the radio. Eventually, I took to going to the co-op and purchasing some trail mix and adding walnuts and cashews, pistachios, etc. A little buffet for her. When the fall started adding a bit of bite to the air, I added a little extra so she could take some home. During the winter, it was too cold to leave the screen door open, so I installed the doggy door and she'd pop through, always punctual for our dates. In January, I noticed she'd gotten a little hefty. I didn't say anything because it's impolite to mention a woman's weight. And then she was gone. I'd be lying if I told you I wasn't hurt, and I'd be lying if I didn't buy better snacks and waft it through the air to entice her back. But it was no use. As I was putting the finishing touches on the house, another coat of interior paint and some finishing work, I heard a little scratch at the back door. I had uninstalled the doggy door by this time. I knew who it was before I turned and started reading her the riot act. I missed the girl, but I wasn't going to let her know. I stopped when I saw 6 bushy tails. I opened the door and she and her kids came in. The kids zigged and zagged, got into just about everything they could have gotten into. But my friend, well, she sat down at her spot and waited for her food, and I gave her about 6 squirrel-sized armfuls. But for a little bit, she sat there eating, and I was beside her drinking. I said, "You should have told me," as one of the kids climbed up my couch and looked down at me like I was a servant and him a prince. When it came time for her to leave, I poured out a couple extra cups of nuts for her and hers, and I watched the family leave. One of the kids had a streak of Cascade Blue on his tail. Then I saw the trail of paint and was thankful I'd decided on laminate instead of carpeting. All that is to say, I was glad of their company. I was glad of the tree for making us neighbors. A part of me wants to keep the house. But then I got to thinking about the things that tree's seen. I imagined the family that planted it when their oldest was barely a toddler. Could see kids in saddle shoes, looking like the Peanuts gang, playing tag in whatever game kids from the 1940s played. I could almost even see the picture of a uniformed son getting ready to leave for a war, or a daughter in her prom dress. I could imagine the same girl, now an 80-year-old woman, being driven past this piece of land and catching a glimpse of the tree and getting warm to the nostalgia of a life that, despite its ups and downs, still had a place that felt safe, that felt like home. And then I got to thinking about my mom, about how maybe she'd like to know how one of her kids was doing. I even got to thinking about buying her a ticket up here so she could see it, and I may yet do that. I tried calling my brother, but apparently he's still sore after our last conversation, and he doesn't much want to talk to me, which I understand. So what I'm saying is, Tim, if you're hearing this, I'm sorry. I know I did you wrong. I know you tried to get me to do right, but I wasn't ready for it. Cold comfort, maybe. But I'm hoping there's still some comfort. And I will say this. I've had the good fortune to take my life for granted. But I always worked construction. I was never a demo man. Tim, watch how good I am at building. And that was At the Root by Oscar McCoy. As I was reading this essay, I got to thinking about my own sibling, my sister Anika. She's an artist in Chicago, a musician, or rather, she was, before she decided to move back to Seattle for the next little bit. She was the reason I met Coraline. They were going to school together in Chicago when one holiday break Coraline came home with Anika. I was struck by just how much I adored my sister's best friend. And I would get excited when the first bite of winter showed up in late November. For some reason, I haven't talked much to my sister since Coraline's passing. We were never close, or at least, that's how I remember it. Instead, we relied on news about the other to filter through Coraline. Perhaps I relied on Coraline too much to care for my relationships. I will have to try to remedy that. And listeners, wherever you are, I hope you know that love is like a flower. You have to care for it to help it grow. This has been Works of Love. I'm Julian Silver. This episode of Works of Love was written and performed by Elliott Rose. Music by Ross Bugden, licensed through Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License. To find more of Ross's music, go to soundcloud.com/Ross Bugden. If you have any thoughts about today's essay, please feel free to reach out to us on Twitter. We're at Works of Love Pod, by email at worksoflovepodcast@gmail.com, or go to our website at wolpod.com. Also, we're having a contest. If you like the show and you want to support us, please leave an iTunes review. If you leave an iTunes review, you will be automatically entered to win a copy of Zen Pencils, Cartoon Quotes from Inspirational Folks by Gavin Ong Tan. The winners will be announced during episode 11. This has been Works of Love. Thank you for listening.